Hello, hello. Can everybody hear me? Yeah, that seems to be doing its job. Cool. So if it's still the first day, and if you haven't had a chance to talk to everybody yet, you might not have experienced how many different job titles we have in this community. Mikey spoiled this a little bit with her slide this morning. Like we have developers, we have technical writers, we have product managers, we have customer support folks, like so many different jobs in this room. But I am here to give all of you a new job title surprise. You are all designers now. I'm Kelly O'Brien. I work on the content design team at Intercom. We build a business messaging platform. If you are ever on the internet and one of these little guys pops up with a little notification for you, that's Intercom. That's what we work on. It's all very exciting. So I've been doing content design with them for about a year. I did not start in content design. I actually went to school for journalism, and I started my early career as a magazine writer and editor. If you want to talk about food magazines, if weirdly, you want to talk about construction magazines, like I Am Your Person. But a couple of years into doing that, I had a conversation with a developer friend who I said, yeah, I'm freelance writing. And she's like, interesting, do you ever do any documentation? I said, yeah, I do that, sure. Which wasn't a lie. Like I did write documentation, but it was all in-house. I was usually the nerdiest person on my magazine staff, so I would write documentation to help my colleagues do the technical things we needed to do. But from that conversation, about 3 months later, I had fired all of my magazine clients, and I was doing technical writing freelance full-time. And I did that for about 5 years, and then I ended up taking a staff position at a customer support software tool, and I was their whole docs team for about 2 years. 2.5 years or so. And then about a year ago, I made the jump into content design. So at this point, it is possible that you are wondering what actually is content design. I would really super like to be able to give you a simple answer, but I cannot. It is a fairly recent discipline unto itself. It's not that people haven't been doing content design for a long time, but treating it the way that we are starting to treat it now is relatively new. It has a lot of different names. Content design comes to us from Sarah Richards at the Government Digital Service. She wrote a book called Content Design and sort of formed the way that we start to talk about it now under that particular name, but it also, a lot of places it's called content strategy. Sometimes it's specifically called product content strategy to differentiate it from the content strategy that happens more on the marketing side of things or on the website side of things. So you have content strategy, you have product content strategy, you have product or content design, but it also is a thing that a lot of other jobs are responsible for. Product designers do a ton of content design, UX designers, system designers, interaction designers, certainly information architects. There's all of these jobs who spend a lot of their time doing content design. Spoilers, documentarians also do a lot of content design, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So there's a lot of different things, names that it goes by. It also looks very different from one organization to the next. Some content designers are tasked to work on a specific problem area really deeply. Other content designers, their job is to sort of advocate for a more horizontal perspective. So they look at the whole system of the product that they're working on and start to try and identify and solve problems that way. Some content design teams are very centralized and they act as sort of like a consultancy within an organization. So you bring your challenging, noodly content design problems to them. Others are distributed, so content designers sit with individual product teams and work like that. Sometimes the team is quite autonomous. They have all of their own processes and structures and things. Other times it's treated as a specialization within a broader team. That's how we do it at Intercom. Content designers fall under the aegis of the product design team. And actually, our job ladder is, we're responsible for 85% of the same things that all of our product designers are responsible for. So we're really treated as a specialization within product design. So that was a lot of words, but the question was, what is content design? And I failed to actually give you a definition. That is because there is not one that everybody just agrees on. I looked at a bunch of different ones. I thought about co-opting Abby Covert's our job is to make the unclear clear from information architecture, but actually I settled on this definition. Content design is a product discipline focused on how to structure and present information. This comes from, this is how Meredith Castile, who's one of my coworkers, she works in our SF office, she busted this out just last week for a lunch and learn internally to help get some more visibility and understanding of our role as a discipline within the company, and she used this definition, and I thought it was quite nice and concrete. Speaking of concrete, the actual work that content designers do is going to look really familiar to you. So if documentarians spend all of their time focused on writing about the product, content designers spend all of their time focused on building the product, all of which is great. The things that we do to do those jobs are, so many of the things are identical. Like, we all work to define the concepts that we are talking about. We all work to map out the systems and the relationships between those concepts. We all build information architecture, whether it's for the product or for a documentation. Like, thinking through how our users are going to experience this information is a ton of what we do. We all structure narratives. A lot of us write UI copy. Maybe not every documentarian writes UI copy, but I bet every documentarian wants to if they don't already. The biggest distinction in my mind is that, like, documentarians typically do most of their work descriptively. So we write about what's already there. Content designers have the opportunity to do all of those same tasks prescriptively and actually use all of that work and insight and information to shape the way that the product grows. So that all sounds rad, right? Like, you're all really excited to be designers now. If there's like a knot in your stomach that's telling you there is probably a catch to this, you are not wrong. You should listen to that knot. The problem that content design has is the same problem that the Titanic had. This iceberg situation. So this is the UX design iceberg from Dan Olson's book, The Lean Product Playbook. I've amended it here for our purposes because it applies just as much to content designers as it does to visual designers. But the problem here is that the surface level of our work takes up maybe 15, maybe 20% of our time. Like, for me as a content designer, a big week, I've written 30 new words. Like, it's very small. The actual output is very small, but it's also the most visible, it's the easiest to understand, and it is the thing that people are most likely to react to. Meanwhile, underneath the surface, there's all of this really heavy-duty, very time-consuming, and incredibly valuable work that is super difficult for passersby, or even people who like know how this works but just don't know the particular project you're working on. It is difficult for them to see, it's difficult for them to understand and value, and it can be difficult to engage in those conversations at the lower level. Because of this, what often ends up happening is we'll get to a point in the new, we'll get to a point with a new part of the product where it's pretty much ready to go. We're ready to push the button. We're ready to ship it out there, but it needs copy. And so you come over to the content designer or the documentarian or the UX writer or whoever is responsible for that copy, and you bring them in at the last minute, and you ask them to put some words on the screen. And this is what happens in those situations. Like, you start asking questions. You're like, okay, cool, what is this thing? Great. What's this thing's relationship to these other things? Cool. What are we calling it in the code? All right. What do we call this other part of the thing that is kind of related but very similar, and we need to make them distinct? And you start asking these questions, and you realize that not a lot of thought has gone into the fact that we are going to need to communicate about this really simply. And so it is, in fact, impossible to communicate about it really simply in the state that it is currently in. What you get in this situation is nothing but frustration. You do not get good copy, and either I am frustrated because I'm not in a position to do my job well because I don't have enough context, or we don't have the time to like reconfigure things so they are easy to talk about, or they get really frustrated because I make them redo the last 2 weeks of work and they don't want to do that, which is understandable. So that's the problem. Sorry, I'm breathing very loudly apparently. That's the problem. How do we go about fixing it? The magic of metaphor, because we're word people, and that's how we fix problems. This metaphor needs a little bit of an introduction. Sam Weingarten was the only content designer who worked at Intercom when I started, and so we spent a lot of time together early on, and she introduced me to this metaphor quite early, and I've spent a lot of the last year thinking about it. So her whole, we'll jump to the end here, her whole thing is like, what if we think about building a product the same way we think about building a house? And this came up because she was in one of those situations where she got asked at the last minute to put copy on something. The people that asked her were not anticipating so much like deep level questioning going in, and everybody got frustrated and whatever. And so she started to try and think about how to communicate all of that deeper level iceberg stuff to the people that she was working with to make them understand why it's so valuable to get us involved earlier in the process. And so the metaphor that she ended up going with was this idea of a house. So if you are building a house and you ask the roofer to come in and you give them no say or insight into how the rest of the house is going up, and then they show up and they're ready to put the roof on the house, and all of the walls are different heights, or they all go in different angles or different directions. Like, there is no easy way to build a nice, tidy roof that sits right on the house, that makes it nice and waterproof. Like, you are putting challenges in front of the roofer at that point. So what if we think about all of the different levels that go into building the house up to the point of the roof level where that surface area of work lives, and get content design involved at all of those processes? So if we break this metaphor down a little bit, we start with the foundation. And the foundation is when we are working in the system model. And we're going to get into this in detail here, but like, the system model is where we map out all the objects in our system and the relationships between those objects and how they interact. So like, foundation is our system model. Once we've got that sorted out, we start to look at information architecture that looks at how we group things semantically, at how we expect our users to be moving through the product and be like spending time in the space that we're constructing. The next is the walls and the windows and the doors of our house are, how people start to interact with it. It's how they get in and out. It's how they can see things or not. Like, all of these interaction points is people actually starting to use our product. And finally, we get up to the roof, and then we can put the words on. And if we have been involved in all of those processes, we are much more likely to end up with walls that are all the same height and a floor plan that's actually going to bear the load of the roof. Like, it's all going to be much more structurally sound. So there are some risks for the house that is our product if content design is not considered really carefully at every one of these stages. In this next section, we're going to go kind of level by level for what the main risks are and what the biggest opportunity for content design to avoid those risks is. And we're actually going to look at some examples for how to kind of communicate the content design perspective in a way that the rest of the product team can consume it and use it to help shape the way that the product is growing. This has been one of the biggest switches for me to jump from documentation into content design. These examples are all sort of visually communicating the same things that I had been working on for years, but had never really put any thought into how to visually communicate them. So this is my favorite section of the talk. So back to our house. Let's see what happens when you do not consider content design at that foundation level of work. You might end up with a house that doesn't have a home. It doesn't sit nicely alongside the other things in the neighborhood or in our product system here. Like, if you don't plan for content design at that system model level, you might end up in a situation like this. The solution to this is to make sure that anytime you're adding virtually anything to a product, you really clearly diagram out all of the objects in the system and what this change is going to mean for that system diagram. So the example we're going to work with here, because I really like being meta, we're going to say that we are working on a help center tool. This system is really super simple. We've got two basic conceptual objects to work with. We've got categories that have a title, and they're either private or they're public. And in those categories, you have an article. And an article is made up of a title, some body text, an author, and a state. And that's it. Super simple, two objects. Let's say that our customers have been telling us that they want to be able to manage not just long-form articles, but they also want the tool to be able to manage frequently asked questions. And they have kind of different needs for what this frequently asked questions kind of content is. And so we need to add this sort of new feature to the system. We have a couple of different options we can think about. We could think about adding a whole new content object specifically for frequently asked questions. So it would sit alongside the article at the same hierarchical tier, but it would be a distinct object. And if it's a distinct object, it can have different properties. Maybe instead of a title and body text, we have like a dedicated, like, this is the question and this is the answer. Maybe if we hear from our customers that they want to have a lot of frequently asked questions, we need to implement some kind of tagging system that lets them categorize things slightly more granularly. Like, introducing a new content object gives us a lot more flexibility for how frequently asked questions are treated in the product. The other option we could consider would be to just add a new attribute to the article object that we already have. So maybe frequently asked questions really are still articles, and it's just a different type of article. And then we give them a binary choice between, is this article a long-form article, or is this article a frequently asked questions? Or even like, maybe this article is a long-form article, but we're going to include it in a separate frequently asked questions situation. Like, this is a much lighter weight that we could introduce the same capability to the same system. The big benefit of content design being addressed at this level here is like getting this clarity at this early in the process is going to be critical to like making sure that the levels that come after it are built up from a shared understanding of what the actual change that you're making to the system. So if we go back to our house, the next level of risk we need to consider is what happens if we have not fully thought through our floor plan. Maybe we don't have enough load-bearing walls and we try to put the whole house together and the whole thing comes falling down. So the solution here is to start looking at our information architecture. And this will be a theme, but like the key with all of these is to build off the level that that has come before it, right? So exploring a couple of different options for your information architecture is a really good way to test out like which of the system model options you chose, which is going to work better for the end user, like this is your first look at what that actual flow is going to start to look like and what the journey is going to start to look like. So here, if you map out a couple of different options, let's say option 1 is the scenario where we've introduced a dedicated content object for frequently asked questions. Maybe because they're distinct, it's important to have to manage the distinct kinds of content objects separately. So maybe your management experience and your navigation experience is dedicated to the different objects. So you have your article section, and you have all of your articles, and you do all of your editing and managing in this one place. Then you have your frequently asked questions section where all of your frequently asked questions live, and maybe the management experience is a little bit different. So like if we've got that separate content object, maybe the IA choice that we should make should reflect how distinct those objects are. Meanwhile, if you've decided to just make frequently asked questions a type of article, maybe your IA should be a little bit lighter weight. And you don't actually need separate sections for editing, but you can represent all of your content objects on one level. So you've just got your categories and all of your articles and FAQs within those categories. So you can do all of the managing and editing in the structure that you've already got all of your content in. So again, like the choice between these is really driven by the choice that you made in the step before. The next bucket of risk that you need to consider that content design is really well positioned to help with is interaction design. Maybe your product house ends up with doors and windows that are really hard to use. You can't get at the door. Maybe all the windows have different latches. Like you haven't really thought through in any kind of holistic way what the interactions with all of the different parts of your product are and what they can do to reinforce the deeper levels behind them. So at this point, like interaction design in particular has so many different considerations that play into it, but the content design opportunity here is really to advocate for the system level choices that you have already made and make sure that whatever interaction design choices your team is making reflect those system level choices. So to go back to our example here, like for the interaction, that means that maybe the editing experience for the scenario where we've dedicated a content object to frequently asked questions, maybe the editing experience is really dramatically different than the editing experience for an article. Maybe you've got a questions field and an answer field. Maybe the answer field is much shorter to encourage people to keep the content shorter because that works better for frequently asked questions. You have an opportunity now to introduce your tag management piece of the interaction. Like that, this making the editing experience distinct will help to reinforce for your users that these content objects are distinct. Meanwhile, in your other scenario, like the chances that you are going to introduce any dramatic changes to the editing experience between the two different article types is much lower. So if frequently asked questions and long form articles are both just types of articles, like the only difference might be a checkbox that says, show this article in FAQs, or it might be a dropdown that says, what article type is this? It's a much lighter weight change to the interaction design that reflects the lighter weight system change that you've made before. So the final area of risk is the roof. Maybe you end up, you do all of this great system work and then you just punt on the copy and you don't put a ton of thought into it and you end up with copy on top of your product that is not doing its job. Happily, the chances of that are very low because if you have been involved in all of those earlier stages, like all of that deeper work is just going to basically write your copy for you. Like you've done all of this thinking that is going to help you make these choices really quickly. The system model gives you all of your definitions, all of your nouns, all of your objects. It tells you what things you're talking about, what they're made up of, and it makes it really easy for you to communicate that clearly to your users. The information architecture gives you the structure for your narrative. It helps guide your users through the product the way that you expect them to use it. And once you get up to the interactions, they should be tailored to the tasks that your users are doing. So that gives you all of your actions and verbs. And it makes it really easy to have distinct names for each thing because you have already been thinking about what the distinct thing they're doing is all the way from the foundation straight up. So letting all of that deeper work shape your work up here at the surface ends up with much easier to write and much more successful UI copy. Okay, that was like a boatload of information that I've thrown at you and a lot of examples and a lot of stuff. So the question at this point is what do I do with all of that stuff you just threw at me? The first thing I want you to do is acknowledge that you are already doing this work. This is already part of what you do as documentarians. And the next step you can take is just to start fighting for it, to start advocating for it. You are a super valuable resource to your product teams. And maybe some of you already work like this. I know when I was on staff as a technical writer, I ended up doing a lot of content design just because it made my job easier. And I started building these relationships with our front-end devs and with all of our product team, and started getting myself into these conversations. And I would absolutely, if you don't do that already, encourage you to start in on that process. Buy coffee for your designers, for your product marketing team, for your product management, whoever is making these decisions, whoever is having these conversations, build those relationships. Try and get invited as early into the process as possible. Also, you all have jobs to do. You can't also be doing a whole other job, but have a check-in, have a, we're having this ideation meeting or whatever, pick one meeting and try and get into that meeting for every new project. So even if there's just one touch point, you know how they're thinking about it and you can steer them clear of anything that's really gonna make your job difficult further down the road. The other thing I'd encourage you to do is practice sharing this perspective in a slightly more visual language. All of the diagrams and stuff I showed you, I used to do some visual system diagramming when I was doing documentation, but it was mostly for me. They almost never ended up in the docs. It was just a way for me to understand the system that I was working with. And now I make these diagrams every week, and I make them really quickly. Whimsical is a really great tool. That's how I did all of these. And you can put this visual, what I used to use 5 paragraphs of text because I like a wall of text, it makes me feel comfortable. I used to use 5 paragraphs of text to try and explain these things. And if instead I spend 15 minutes putting together a visual representation of that same thing, it is so much easier for me to get my product team to engage with that input. And finally, sell them on how much better the roof level work is going to be if you are involved in the process from the foundation. Everybody is going to end up happier. It's going to save you time. It's going to make the quality of your product better. It's win-win-win. If this sounds super awesome and the appeal of working on the product side of things, is within you, think about making the jump to content design. There are more and more content design and product content strategy jobs every day. We're going to be hiring in our Dublin office quite soon. I don't think it's quite live yet, but that's something to look out for. Keep an eye out for these jobs because it's really, really fun to be able to use all of this expertise that you already have to help shape the product instead of just describe how the product is growing. So thanks so much for listening. I love talking about docs and content design. I am just recently returned to Twitter after a hiatus, so if you want to hit me up on Twitter, I am on Twitter. If you want to hit me up here in person, I'm here for the rest of the conference, and thanks for your time.